Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most underrated survival hacks, Mongolian milk fermentation. Picture this. You blink awake inside a low, circular gur, the felt walls glowing amber from the sunrise. The air is thick with the sour-sweet punch of fermenting mare's milk, a smell that clings to your robes like a loyal horse. Outside, the steppe stretches endlessly, and your breakfast isn't cereal. It's a frothy, slightly alcoholic brew that's about to fuel your entire day. Now, you might think, how hard could fermenting milk really be? But let's be real, if I dropped you in 13th century Mongolia with just a bucket and a mare, you'd probably end up with a stomach-churning science experiment instead of a drinkable probiotic masterpiece. No judgment. Even Genghis Khan had to start somewhere. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and your local time. Is it midnight in Tokyo? High noon in Texas? Either way, you're in the right place. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not just waking up to any morning. You're waking up in the golden age of the Mongol Empire, where milk isn't just food. It's currency, medicine, and sometimes even warfare strategy. The Mongols didn't just conquer the largest contiguous empire in history on an empty stomach. They did it on a diet of fermented dairy, turning grass, via horse stomachs, into liquid gold. Historians still argue whether it was Mongol horsemanship or their gut microbiomes that made them unstoppable. Okay, fine, it was probably both. But here's a mainstream fact to ground us. Mongol warriors could ride for days with little more than dried meat and kumis, their signature fermented mare's milk, because it packed calories, hydration, and a sneaky buzz into one lightweight leather flask. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some scholars think the Mongols' love of fermented milk might explain why they were so chill about lactose intolerance. Most of humanity can't digest raw milk as adults, but fermentation breaks down lactose, meaning even the most dairy-averse Mongol could chug kumis without consequences. Imagine the alternative. Not ideal mid-cavalry charge. And let's not skip the fringe theory that kumis was the original energy drink. Some accounts describe warriors drinking it before battle for a mix of courage and clarity. Was it the alcohol, the probiotics, or just the sheer placebo power of believing your mare's milk made you invincible? We'll never know. But tonight, as you sink into your pillow, just remember, somewhere on the Mongolian steppe, a herder is still stirring a vat of milk under the stars, keeping alive a tradition that once fueled an empire. The rhythmic sloshing of milk in a leather sack tied to a saddle reminds you, this isn't just breakfast, it's the Mongolian lifeline. As you step out of the gur, the wind carries the sharp tang of fermenting dairy from a dozen nearby households. Every family has their own microbial fingerprint in those bubbling concoctions, passed down through generations like a living heirloom. Here's the thing about Mongolian nomads. They didn't just drink fermented milk because it tasted good, though acquired taste is putting it mildly. This was survival biochemistry at its finest. When your entire existence hinges on animals that eat grass you can't digest, fermentation becomes the ultimate hack. It's like nature's version of a food processor, taking something useless to humans, raw milk, and transforming it into a nutrient-dense, shelf-stable superfood. Mainstream history loves talking about Mongol military tactics, but here's a fact they often skip. A single mare produces only about 1 to 2 liters of milk daily during grazing season. Now do the math. How do you feed an army on that? Fermentation, baby. By letting microbes do the heavy lifting, they stretched every drop into something that could last months in a saddlebag. Now for the weird bit. Some herders believed the best kumis came from sacks that were never fully cleaned. That whitish film coating the interior? That's your starter culture. A microbial heirloom more precious than gold. There are families in Mongolia today who claim their fermentation vessels contain microbes directly descended from Genghis Khan's personal stash. Talk about drinking like a king. Historians still argue whether the Mongols' fermented dairy diet gave them an unexpected advantage. Specifically, whether all those probiotics created armies with healthier gut biomes than their settled adversaries. Imagine facing a horde of warriors who never got dysentery. Terrifying. As you watch a herder expertly churn a fresh batch by rhythmically kicking the leather sack tied to his saddle, you realize this isn't food science. It's edible alchemy. The same motions his great-great-grandfather used, creating the same fizzy, tangy brew that once fueled history's most formidable cavalry. The secret weapon was never just the horse, it was what was in the flask. The horizon shimmers under the midday sun as you watch a Mongol scout dismount, his leather flask sloshing with the same frothy brew you've been nervously sipping all morning. He gulps it down in one go, wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, and grins. This is the original energy drink, and it's about to take over the world. Genghis Khan's empire didn't just run on horses. It ran on Kumis. While European armies were bogged down by supply wagons of bread and beer, Mongol warriors traveled light with their lacto-fermented liquid rations. Each rider carried enough concentrated nutrition in their saddlebags to cover 100 miles in a day without stopping to cook. Historians still argue whether it was the protein, the probiotics, or the slight alcohol content, usually 2 to 3% ABV, that gave them their legendary endurance, but the results speak for themselves. An empire stretching from Poland to Korea doesn't build itself on an empty stomach. Here's a mainstream fact that puts things in perspective. Marco Polo wrote that Mongol warriors could ride for 10 days straight without lighting fires, living entirely on kumis and dried meat paste. The Venetian merchants seemed both impressed and slightly horrified by their ability to function, even thrive, on what looked like spoiled milk to his Mediterranean sensibilities. Now, for the delightful weirdness, some of the earliest chemical warfare might have involved kumis. There are accounts of besieged cities catching whiffs of the Mongol camps outside their walls and assuming the invaders were suffering from some terrible plague. Nope, just a few thousand guys who'd been drinking fermented mare's milk for months straight. The fringe theory? That cities sometimes surrendered just to make the smell go away. As you take another cautious sip from your own bowl, you notice something unexpected. The initial sour punch gives way to a creamy, almost nutty aftertaste. It's not unpleasant, just different, like drinking the steppe itself. The scout laughs at your expression and refills your bowl without asking. Some traditions, it seems, are non-negotiable. That faint hissing sound coming from the leather sack tied to the gear's frame? That's the sound of microscopic alchemists at work. Wild yeast and bacteria performing a biochemical ballet that turns plain mare's milk into something far more potent. You lean closer, catching whiffs of tangy, bready fermentation that would make a sourdough baker weep with envy. Here's the microbial magic trick. When Mongolian herders pour fresh milk into those traditional kokor vessels, they're not just storing liquid, they're curating an entire ecosystem. The real MVP is Lactobacillus bulgaricus. Yes, the same bacteria in your yogurt, but it's got backup singers, wild yeasts that add carbonation and a gentle buzz. Historians still argue whether the Mongols truly understood the science, but their meticulous temperature control, keeping sacks near the gear's warmest wall, proves they mastered the practice. Mainstream science only caught up in the 20th century, but here's a fun fact. That whitish biofilm lining well-used fermentation vessels. It's a SCOBY-like matrix called kefrin that's now known to have antimicrobial properties. Basically, the Mongols were brewing penicillin before it was cool. Now for the delightful weirdness. Some herders still swear the best batches come from sacks rubbed with a special green moss found only on north-facing rocks. Is it superstition, or does that moss harbor unique microbes? Modern labs are still testing samples, but in the meantime, every spring you'll see grandmothers scraping moss like master pharmacists. As you watch a herder strain a fresh batch through horsehair, nature's perfect filter, you realize this isn't just food preparation. It's a daily ritual with the microbial world. Those bubbles rising in your cup, that's the breath of countless invisible allies, the same ones that helped shape history one fermented sip at a time. You're about to witness something that would make a modern food scientist clutch their lab coat in horror. A Mongolian grandmother inoculating a fresh batch of milk by dunking a crusty, unwashed wooden paddle into the liquid. No sterile environments, no pH meters, just centuries of instinctual microbial husbandry. This is Nomad Science at its most beautifully unrefined. Long before Pasteur peered into a microscope, Mongolian herders were running what amounted to massive mobile fermentation labs. Their secret? Observation and ruthless quality control. They might not have known about bacteria, but they knew that if you stirred the batch clockwise at dawn and counterclockwise at dusk, you'd get better fizz. That milk from Mare's grazing on spring's first grasses made the most potent brew. That thunderstorm season batches always fermented faster, likely due to atmospheric pressure changes. We now realize. Here's a mainstream fact that'll twist your brain. Some of the fermentation techniques used today in Mongolia are virtually identical to those described in the secret history of the Mongols, the oldest surviving Mongolian literature from 1227. That's 800 years of perfecting the art of controlled spoilage. Now for the quirky tidbit. Mongolians had an early form of expiration dating. They judged a batch's readiness by listening to the sound it made when poured. Young Kumis gurgled like a mountain stream, mature Airag hissed like an angry cat, and over-fermented batches, well, those were reserved for cleaning leather or punishing misbehaving sons-in-law. Historians still argue whether the Mongols' understanding of fermentation gave them an edge over settled civilizations. After all, while medieval Europeans were busy burning witches and fearing sour milk, the Mongols were harnessing microbial power to fuel their empire. As you watch today's herders use the same techniques their ancestors did, judging bubbles by ear, testing tartness with a quick dip of the finger, you realize some science transcends laboratories. Sometimes, the most advanced technology is a well-seasoned wooden paddle and generations of careful observation. The mare paws impatiently as the herder's practiced hands begin milking, each rhythmic squeeze producing a thin stream of bluish-white liquid. You'd expect this to be like milking a cow, but there's one glaring difference. The mare keeps turning her head to glare at you, as if to say, I tolerate this for exactly 5 minutes daily, make it count. Here's the dairy dilemma that shaped empires. Horses produce milk in tiny quantities compared to cows, and only for about 5 months after foaling. A single mare might give just 1 to 2 liters per day, barely enough to wet the bottom of a modern supermarket milk jug. So why base your entire civilization on such stubborn, low-yield animals? Because on the unforgiving steppe, horses weren't just milk machines. They were transportation, warfare, status symbols, and living fermentation accelerators all in one. Mainstream history often overlooks this, but mare's milk has unique properties that made it the Mongol MVP. It contains nearly 40% more lactose than cow's milk, perfect for fermentation fuel, and higher levels of omega-3s, crucial for brain function during those long, freezing winters. Modern analysis shows it's also richer in lysozyme, a natural antibacterial enzyme that may have protected nomads from foodborne illnesses. Now for the bizarre twist. Some Mongol clans believed the best milk came from mares who'd recently raced. There are 13th century accounts of warriors taking their fastest mares on quick gallops before milking, convinced the exercise improved the milk's spirit. Turns out they weren't entirely wrong. Recent studies show exercise does temporarily increase certain proteins in horse milk. Historians still argue whether the Mongols' reliance on horses rather than cattle gave them an unexpected military edge. While European armies dragged slow-moving dairy cows behind their forces, Mongol warriors had fresh milk supplies that could keep pace with their lightning cavalry strikes. As you watch today's herders still using the same quick milking techniques, always leaving enough for the foal, always finishing before the mare loses patience. You realize this was never just about nutrition, it was about building an entire civilization around the most versatile animal on Earth. The argument erupts at dawn when two herders from rival clans meet at the seasonal milking grounds. One proudly pours his cloudy, effervescent brew into a wooden bowl, true Airag. He insists, with the proper sour bite. The other sniffs, producing his own clearer, milder version, civilized Kumis. He counters, fit for the great Khan himself. You're witnessing a debate that's divided steppe cultures for centuries. What exactly constitutes the perfect fermented mare's milk? Here's the frothy truth. While outsiders lump all Mongolian fermented dairy together, regional variations were, and still are, as fiercely defended as clan territories. In the western grasslands, they prefer Airag, tart, fizzy, and left to ferment for days in smoked leather sacks that impart a distinctive woody flavor. Eastern clans swear by their Kumis, sweeter, smoother, and often enhanced with a pinch of wild mountain herbs. The alcohol content ranges from barely there to might explain some battle tactics, depending on who's brewing and how long they dare let the fermentation run. Mainstream food history often misses this, but these differences weren't just about taste. They reflected deep environmental adaptations. High-altitude Airag developed more acetic acid, better for preserving nutrients in thin air, while lowland Kumis cultures favored milder lactofermentation, ideal for hydration in arid regions. Modern labs confirm what herders knew instinctively. Microbial populations vary dramatically across the steppe's microclimates. Now for the delightful oddity. Some historical accounts describe drunken cheese, a bizarre byproduct of over-fermented Airag left in sheep stomachs during long campaigns. The resulting crumbly, pungent substance was apparently eaten only during desperate sieges, and even hardened warriors reportedly drew straws to avoid getting stuck with it. Historians still argue whether these regional fermentation styles influenced Mongol expansion patterns. Did Eastern clans conquer more territory simply because their sweeter Kumis was easier to drink in large quantities? As you're forced to judge between the two herders' offerings, both watching your face intently, you realize this isn't just about dairy. It's about identity, tradition, and the infinite human capacity to argue about food. The Western herder's final word as you cough from his potent brew. If it doesn't make your eyes water, it's just mare's milk. The shaman's drum beats in sync with the bubbling of the sacred fermentation sack as he circles the fire, his chants weaving between the hiss of carbonation escaping the leather vessel. This isn't just brewing. It's alchemy with divine intervention. You're witnessing the spiritual side of Mongolian milk fermentation, where every bubble carries prayers to the sky gods. Fermented mare's milk wasn't merely sustenance on the steppe. It was a bridge between worlds. Ancient Mongolians believed the very act of fermentation mirrored cosmic processes, transforming the ordinary into the sacred through invisible forces. Shamans used Airag in rituals to induce trance states, its slight alcohol content and probiotic compounds possibly enhancing their visions. There are accounts of oracles drinking specially fermented batches before predicting the future, their prophecies delivered between frothy burps. Mainstream history often sanitizes this aspect, but here's a documented fact. When Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes, he specifically incorporated milk libation ceremonies into state rituals. Conquered peoples were required to present fermented dairy offerings as signs of submission, a spiritual surrender as much as a political one. Now for the wonderfully weird part. Some scholars argue the distinctive Mongolian, throat-singing tradition developed specifically to mimic the sounds of active fermentation. The low gurgles and harmonic overtones do uncannily resemble a vigorously brewing batch of Kumis. Next time you hear those deep, vibrating tones, imagine you're listening to a 13th century probiotic culture at work. Historians still argue whether the spiritual significance of fermented milk gave the Mongols psychological edge in battle. Imagine facing warriors who genuinely believed their khans drank with the gods through shared cups of sacred Airag. As the shaman sprinkles the last drops of his ritual brew into the fire, the flames hissing and dancing, you realize this was never just about nutrition. It was about transforming Mare's milk into liquid mythology, one sacred bubble at a time. The steel fermentation vats gleam under fluorescent lights, a Soviet-era dairy plant where the echoing clangs of machinery have replaced the familiar slosh of leather sacks. You've stepped into the 20th century, where Mongolia's ancient fermentation traditions collided headfirst with industrial modernization. The air smells not of wild yeast and horsehair, but of bleach and standardized pasteurization. This was the great fermentation fracture, when centuries of microbial wisdom nearly vanished under political ideology. Soviet planners, obsessed with sanitizing food production, built factories to replace nomadic practices. They mandated pasteurization, killing the very cultures that made fermentation possible, promoted cow's milk over mare's, easier to industrialize, and even tried to market carbonated Kumis soda, a spectacular failure that tasted, according to one account, like sweetened horse sweat. By the 1970s, UNESCO would list Mongolian milk fermentation as an endangered intangible cultural heritage. A tradition that had survived Genghis Khan couldn't survive central planning. Mainstream histories of communism often overlook this, but here's a telling fact. During the worst food shortages of the Soviet era, city-dwelling Mongols secretly traded ration cards for contraband Airag from underground herder networks. The very people who were supposed to embrace progress were risking punishment for a taste of their microbial birthright. Now for the darkly comic twist. The Soviet-improved Kumis recipe included adding industrial-grade hydrochloric acid to speed fermentation. The resulting concoction was so corrosive it reportedly ate through storage tanks, which might be the most poetic act of microbial rebellion in history. Historians still argue whether the decline of traditional fermentation contributed to Mongolia's 20th century health crises. As you watch a factory worker mechanically stir a steel vat of standardized product, the ghosts of 1,000 grandmothers' starter cultures seem to whisper from the sterile walls. The real tragedy wasn't just lost flavors. It was the severing of a living thread connecting people to their environment, their history, and the invisible world of microbes that had sustained them for millennia. The sterile white lab glows under LED lights as a scientist in Ulaanbaatar carefully pipettes a sample of 800-year-old Kumis microbes into a petri dish. These aren't just any bacteria, they're descendants of Genghis Khan's gut microbiome, resurrected from scrapings taken from ancient fermentation vessels in museum collections. Welcome to the cutting edge where genomics meets nomadic tradition. Modern science is finally catching up to what Mongolian herders knew instinctively. Their fermented dairy is a probiotic powerhouse. Recent studies reveal that traditional Airag contains up to 40 unique microbial strains, many with potent anti-inflammatory and immune-boosting properties. Pharmaceutical companies are now racing to patent these extremophile bacteria that evolved to survive both the harsh steppe winters and the even harsher environment of the human digestive tract. Mainstream medicine is taking notice. Here's a fact that would make any Mongol warrior nod in satisfaction. One strain isolated from Mongolian fermented milk, Lactobacillus fermentum MAG6, has shown remarkable effectiveness against antibiotic-resistant superbugs in clinical trials. The same microbes that powered the Mongol Empire might soon be helping hospitals fight MRSA. Now for the delicious irony, Western wellness influencers paying top dollar for authentic Mongolian starter cultures, unaware that the real magic happens not in a sanitized packet, but in the complex microbial ecosystems of well-used traditional vessels. There's a booming black market in heirloom fermentation sacks smuggled out of Mongolia, with some aging hippies in California apparently willing to pay thousands for a scrap of felt from a herder's gur that's been absorbing fermentation vapors for generations. Historians still argue whether we're witnessing cultural appropriation or long overdue recognition. As you watch the lab technician compare ancient DNA sequences to modern samples, the circularity becomes clear. The future of medicine might depend on preserving what nearly vanished under Soviet factories. Those leather sacks on the steppe aren't just relics. They're living libraries of microbial wisdom, each bubble a chapter in an ongoing story of symbiosis between humans and their invisible allies. The goat stares at you with unsettling yellow eyes as the herder squeezes a jet of milk directly into your cup. No ceremony, no fermentation, just warm, grassy-smelling liquid that's somehow both sweet and gamey. For your lungs, he insists, watching you expectantly. You're about to discover why, in certain remote valleys, fermented goat milk is considered not just food but medicine. While Mare's milk gets all the historical attention, Mongolia's goat herders have been quietly perfecting their own potent fermentations. The secret lies in the goat's diet. They browse on wild herbs like wormwood and thyme that infuse their milk with antimicrobial compounds. When fermented, these become concentrated into what traditional healers call the drink of long breaths, used to treat everything from tuberculosis to postpartum recovery. Modern studies now show certain Mongolian goat milk ferments contain bioactive peptides that may actually help clear respiratory infections. Mainstream nutrition science is just catching up to this. Here's a startling fact. Goat milk naturally contains higher levels of medium-chain fatty acids than cow or mare milk, making it more efficiently converted to energy. Some researchers speculate this could explain why goat herding clans were historically able to thrive in Mongolia's most extreme high-altitude environments where other livestock struggled. Now for the bizarre twist. There's a peculiar tradition among Tuvan goat herders of fermenting milk in hollowed-out pine logs buried near hot springs. The resulting brew, called koitpak, develops a viscous, almost slimy texture and a funky aroma described alternately as earthy or like a wet sheep. Despite its challenging appearance, it's considered a powerful tonic, with families guarding their log locations as closely as trade secrets. Historians still argue whether the medicinal use of fermented goat milk gave certain clans an edge in surviving Mongolia's harsh winters. As you choke down your cup, the herder nodding approvingly at your grimace, you realize this isn't just about taste. It's about an entire pharmacopoeia developed through centuries of careful observation, where every gulp represents an intimate understanding of the land and its hidden remedies. The goat, satisfied with your suffering, wanders off to chew on some artemisia, its work here done. The yak butter tea hits your lips like a warm, salty tide, an unexpected collision of dairy and tannins that somehow works. You're at a high-altitude crossroads where Mongolian and Tibetan traditions blend, and the star ingredient is a golden lump of fermented yak butter so dense it could double as a building material. This is dairy alchemy at its most extreme, perfected over centuries to combat thin air and freezing temperatures. Yak milk fermentation follows different rules than its mare and goat counterparts. At 3,000 meters above sea level, the colder temperatures and lower oxygen levels create a slower, funkier fermentation process. The result? Butter that can last for years and cheese so hard it's traditionally carried as trail rations. Nomads would shave off flakes with their knives like some kind of prehistoric protein bar. Mainstream food science is fascinated by this. Here's a concrete fact. Fermented yak dairy contains significantly higher concentrations of conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, than other milks, a compound shown to help with oxygen utilization. This might explain why Tibetan and Mongolian high-altitude herders could function where lowlanders gasped for breath. Now for the wonderful weirdness. Some Himalayan monasteries still maintain butter libraries, where blocks of fermented yak butter are aged for decades like fine wine. The oldest known specimen, kept in a Bhutanese dzong, dates back to 1644 and is allegedly used teaspoon by teaspoon as emergency medicine, though visitors report it now smells like a cross between blue cheese and diesel fuel. Historians still argue whether the yak butter trade helped forge cultural connections across the Himalayas long before modern borders existed. As you sip the rich, salty tea, watching your host toss in another thumb-sized butter chunk for good measure, you realize this is more than sustenance. It's liquid adaptation, a mastery of fermentation so complete that it literally reshapes human bodies to survive where nature never intended us to thrive. The yak grazing outside the tent door seems to nod in approval, its shaggy coat frosted with snow. This partnership was always meant to be. The wrinkled cheese while sitting on the gare's low table looks innocent enough, until your host whacks it with a cleaver and the sound echoes like he struck stone. This is Airag, Mongolia's version of cheese. Except there's a catch. Traditional Mongolian cheese contains exactly 0 rennet. What you're about to taste is one of history's great dairy cheats. A clever workaround born from necessity on the protein-starved steppe. Here's how the magic works. Instead of using animal enzymes to curdle milk, Mongolians developed an acid-based method involving fermented whey as a starter. The milk is boiled, then soured with old whey until it separates into curds that are pressed, dried, and left to harden into tooth-breaking slabs. The result is a shelf-stable protein bomb that could survive an apocalypse. Archaeologists have found edible Airag in tombs over 500 years old. Mainstream food history rarely mentions this, but here's a significant fact. This rennet-free technique allowed Mongolians to make cheese without slaughtering young animals for their stomach enzymes. A crucial adaptation for a culture where every livestock life was precious. Some scholars believe this method predates conventional cheesemaking in Asia by centuries. Now for the delightful oddity. Certain Mongolian tribes use cheese as primitive food preservation. There are accounts of warriors embedding strips of meat in Airag before drying, creating a sort of prehistoric protein bar that combined meat's nutrients with cheese's preserving acidity. Modern recreations suggest it tasted like beef jerky marinated in sour cream, which was apparently delicious if you'd been riding across the Gobi for weeks. Historians still argue whether this unique cheese-making method contributed to the Mongols' military success. Lightweight, non-perishable, and packed with calories, Airag was the perfect campaign food. As you gnaw cautiously on your rock-hard piece, your host laughing as you fail to make a dent, you realize this isn't just cheese. It's the physical manifestation of nomadic ingenuity, a dairy product that defies all conventions to fulfill its singular purpose: survival. The glow of a smartphone screen illuminates the young woman's face as she carefully compares her bubbling plastic tub to a YouTube tutorial titled Grandma's Airag Recipe, Step by Step. Outside the apartment window, the lights of Ulaanbaatar twinkle. This is Mongolia's fermentation revival, where ancient traditions are being reclaimed through modern technology. Across the country, urban Mongolians are reconnecting with their dairy heritage in the most 21st century ways imaginable. Instagram accounts document #fermentation journeys, startups sell DIY Kumis kits with QR codes linking to instructional videos, and university students run microbiome experiments on traditional clay fermentation vessels. After nearly disappearing under Soviet industrialization, Mongolia's milk fermentation culture is experiencing a renaissance, with some contemporary twists. Mainstream media often misses this, but here's a telling fact. Sales of traditional fermentation vessels in Ulaanbaatar have increased 300% in the past decade, mostly to young professionals. Even more surprising, modern health food stores now stock freeze-dried starter cultures, isolated from museum artifacts, allowing city dwellers to brew Airag with microbes literally descended from Genghis Khan's era. Now for the ironic twist. Some herders are now learning refined techniques from YouTube videos their grandchildren sent them. There's a particular viral clip of a 75-year-old grandmother reacting to a French sommelier's Airag tasting tutorial. He holds it all wrong. That's been viewed over 2 million times. The comments section is a delightful mix of Mongolian pride and global curiosity, with one particularly poignant note reading, "My grandfather rode with the last nomadic kings. Now his recipes live in my smart fridge." Historians still argue whether this revival represents true cultural preservation or just trendy nostalgia. But as you watch the young woman taste her first successful homemade batch, her face lighting up with recognition of a flavor she only knew from childhood visits to the countryside, it's clear something profound is happening. The chain of microbial knowledge, nearly broken, is reconnecting through fiber optic cables and social media algorithms. The future of Mongolian fermentation might just depend on remembering the past, one carefully monitored plastic tub at a time. The stars blaze overhead as you settle onto a felt cushion inside the gur. The air thick with the mingled scents of smoked leather, fermented dairy, and slow-cooked mutton. Around the circular space, generations overlap. Grandmothers stirring pots using techniques unchanged in centuries. Teenagers discreetly checking fermentation temps with digital thermometers. Children sneaking fingerfuls of fresh arrowroot when they think no one's looking. This is no historical reenactment. It's living tradition in its most vibrant form. Your host passes you an intricately carved wooden cup filled with Airag so fresh it still fizzes at the edges. As you raise it to your lips, time collapses. The tart, effervescent taste is the same that fueled empire builders and comforted nomadic families through endless winters. The microbes dancing on your tongue share DNA with those that survived Genghis Khan's campaigns, Soviet industrialization, and now the strange new world of globalization and climate change. Mainstream history often treats cultures as static, but here's the beautiful truth. Every sip contains adaptations. The grandmother across from you now adds a pinch of commercial yeast to ensure consistency in changing climates. The father by the door experiments with vacuum-sealing arrowroot for his son studying abroad. The fermentation vessels may be plastic instead of leather. The milk may come from a refrigerated truck rather than directly from the Mare, but the essential alchemy remains. Now for the perfect full-circle moment. Outside, you spot the family's youngest daughter teaching her university friend from Seoul how to judge fermentation readiness by sound. As the Korean student tentatively shakes a bottle and listens for the telltale hiss, her delighted laugh mingles with the older women's approving nods. Some things do transcend time and technology. Historians will probably always argue about what authentic Mongolian fermentation truly means. But as the night deepens and stars will overhead, as cups are refilled and stories shared between generations, the answer seems obvious. It's whatever keeps the knowledge alive, whatever maintains that sacred connection between people, animals, and the invisible microbial world that makes it all possible. The taste remains true, even as the methods evolve. As the Gare's fire burns low and the last cups are drained, let your mind linger on those invisible threads connecting past to present. The microbes still working their magic, the hands still stirring the vessels, the stars still shining on the endless steppe. There's comfort in knowing some rhythms persist despite centuries of change. The Airag's gentle buzz lingers as you sink deeper into cushions, watching shadows dance on felt walls. Outside, a mare nickers to her foal, the sound carrying across grasslands where countless generations before this one also marked time by fermentation cycles and grazing seasons. The night air carries whispers of ancient knowledge adapting, but never disappearing, just transforming, like milk into something greater than its parts. Let your breathing slow to match the steady burble of the fermentation sack in the corner, that ancient lullaby of bubbles rising through liquid. However far you are from the Mongolian steppe right now, you're part of this story too. A momentary participant in an unbroken chain of curious humans marveling at nature's alchemy. As sleep pulls gently at the edges of your awareness, imagine those microscopic cultures still multiplying in the dark, sustaining traditions as old as empires, as resilient as the people who nurtured them through every upheaval history could bring. The fermentation never really stops. It just waits for new hands to continue the work, for new generations to rediscover the old wisdom in each tart, effervescent sip